we come from? We're often told that we need to answer that question by saying either that we were created by God or that we evolved, and that's where we came from. But I want to suggest that way of thinking about things isn't quite right, that we may not be forced to choose between that either or, that we may not be forced to choose between saying that we're either created or that we're evolved. But in order to get there, I'm going to have to set some context. In order to do that, I want us actually to look to a passage from the philosopher Plato. So I'm going to read you a little passage, and this comes from Plato in the dialogue that he's written, a dialogue starring Socrates, as Plato's dialogues tend to have. It's called the Phaedrus. And in this passage, his character Socrates is reflecting on an explanation of why he is sitting, right? So how can you explain why I'm sitting here? Fairly easy sort of question, right? I mean, it's almost a silly thing to ask, but this is what Socrates is reflecting on, is how might you explain why I'm sitting here? And here's what he says. Were I to say that I'm sitting here now because first, my body is composed of bones and sinews, and the bones are hard and have joints separating them, while the sinews, for their part, contract and relax and cover the bones along the flesh and the skin that contains them. And that because the bones move freely in their joints, the contracting and relaxing of the sinews somehow enables me to bend my limbs now. And this is the cause of my sitting here in a bent position. If someone were to say that, without having bones and sinews and such, I would not be able to do what I believe best, that would be true. But to say that I do what I do because of these, and therein act with thought, but not on account of choosing what I believe best, that would be an extremely careless way of speaking. That's the end of the quote. What does it mean? Well, just this. It was sort of a roundabout way that Socrates uses here, I think, to make a really simple but really important point. And it's this. If someone asks you why you're sitting somewhere, maybe you're sitting on a rock. That's whenever I read this, I always imagine Socrates sitting on a rock somewhere. Maybe you're sitting on a rock, sitting on a chair, and someone comes up to you and says, hey, why are you sitting there? And you start saying, well, the reason I am sitting here is because I have these bones, and the bones have joints, and the joints have tendons that are attached to them, and I have these muscles, and when the muscles contract in this way, you start going on and on and on about your bones and muscles and your sinews, as Socrates likes to talk about here. Well, Socrates says, in a way, what you're saying is right. I mean, I'm not going to say that you don't have those muscles and bones and sinews, but if the question was simply, why are you sitting there? That wasn't the kind of answer you were expecting, right? Instead, you were expecting an answer like, oh, I'm sitting here because I'm waiting for a friend, or I'm sitting here because I've been walking a long time and I'm really tired. So what does this suggest? It suggests that in this single question, why are you sitting there? There are several different appropriate ways of answering that question in different kinds of contexts. When Socrates, or again, if you or I are sitting somewhere and someone asks us, why are you sitting there? The appropriate thing to do is not to start talking about our bones and sinews and muscles, but rather to say why we're sitting there, that we are tired or that we are waiting for a friend or something like that. However, if you were to ask that same question maybe in a biology classroom, and you were to say, your biology teacher was to say, why are you sitting there? Well, then all of a sudden, the answer about your bones and sinews and muscles and things becomes the relevant one. So that's our lesson. You can have one question, but have two very different kinds of answers that are appropriate in different contexts. This is an important point too. They can be both perfectly true and correct answers. So Socrates says in that passage, well, of course it's true that my muscles have contracted in a certain way. That's just not the answer I was looking for. I was looking for an answer that had to do with I'm tired or I'm waiting for a friend or something like that. So that's what I want to suggest is actually happening too with this question, where did we come from? So when we hear this question, where do we come from? And we're in a scientific perspective. So suppose you're sitting in a science class, or suppose you're a working scientist and you're trying to answer that question. The correct way to answer that question is going to be in reference to natural processes and natural laws and what's happened in the past and that sort of thing. And what's the best explanation we have right now of where humans came from? Well, evolutionary theory. So it shouldn't be surprising that from a scientific perspective, when you're asked, where did we come from? You're going to get a scientific answer. And in fact, our best scientific answer right now is that we have evolved. So where did we come from? Well, we've evolved. That's the scientific perspective on that question, where did we come from? But notice, we can also ask that question, where did we come from, in a different kind of way. Just as I can ask you, why are you sitting there, and be looking for a scientific explanation of your bones and sinews, but I can also be asking for your reasons for sitting there, because I'm waiting for a friend or because I'm tired. So too, I can ask, where did you come from, and be looking for a scientific explanation because I evolved, but I might ultimately be asking that question to look for something deeper. I might be asking, where did I come from, in the sense of, why am I here rather than not here? What meaning does my life have? Why was I here in the first place? Why should I be here rather than somebody else, or rather than not be here at all? When you ask it in that way, what I want to suggest is that this is where the theistic idea of creation comes in. If you have the time, I'd encourage you to go and actually look at Genesis 1 and 2. And when you read that account, you'll notice that it's not giving us an explanation of where we came from in terms of natural processes. It's not telling us the mechanics of exactly how God created the heavens and the earth. It's rather answering the question in a different sense. It's answering the question in the sense of, why did God create us? What meaning does life have? And when you read it in that sense, you'll see that the culmination of the accounts given in Genesis 1 and 2 of our creation has to do with God creating everything, and God creating everything good. And in creating everything good, God creating us in such a way that our lives have meaning, because we've been created by an all-powerful and all-good God. So Genesis, in the theological perspective, answers that question, where did we come from? Not in terms of natural processes, but rather in terms of that sense in which we can ask that question, why does my life have meaning? Why am I here at all? So what does all this show? What I want to suggest is that it shows that when we look at that question, where did we come from? We don't have to choose between I was either created or I evolved. Instead, we can look at that question a lot like the question, why are you sitting there? You can answer that question from a scientific perspective, naturalistic perspective, where you talk about bones and sinews and they're contracting and relaxing, and that's why you're sitting there. But you can also answer that question for the reasons why you're sitting there. Because I'm tired, because I am waiting for a friend. Likewise, when you're asked the question, where did I come from? Sure, we can answer that question from a scientific, naturalistic perspective. And when we do that, we may wind up saying that, well, I'm here because I and human beings evolved. But we can also ask that question and answer that question about why we're here at all, about what kind of meaning our lives have. And when we answer it in that way, we may look to the biblical account of creation and say, why am I here? Well, because I was created. In conclusion, what I want to suggest today is that this question, why are we here? We need not choose between saying we're created or we're evolved. We can, in fact, approach that question in two different ways and say both. We're both created and we're evolved. Dilemma solved.